It was a bright and bustling morning in the heart of the city as people hurried in and out of the street coffee shop on the corner of Hudson Street. Cars honked, pedestrians bustled along the sidewalk, and the hum of city life filled the air. Among the crowd was a black woman named Alara Morgan, standing outside the cafe. She was dressed simply but confidently in a navy blue jacket and pressed slacks, with a slight smile on her face as she glanced at her watch. She was waiting patiently for her coffee order, letting the morning sun warm her skin as she took a deep breath, savoring a few moments of calm. Just then, a white police officer, Brian Miller, noticed her as he walked by, tall and imposing in his uniform. Officer Miller carried an air of authority that often turned to arrogance when he felt his power was challenged or, in this case, when he felt it needed to be established. His eyes landed on Alara, and a flicker of suspicion crossed his face. To him, she didn't seem like she fit into the usual clientele for this upscale neighborhood coffee shop. With an indignant stride, Miller walked over to her, his hand hovering near his badge. He didn't bother to introduce himself or politely ask what she was doing. Instead, he went straight into interrogation mode. "What are you doing here?" he barked, looking her up and down with a slight sneer. The words cut sharply, breaking the calm Alara had been enjoying just seconds before. Alara looked at him with a polite but firm expression. "Just waiting for my coffee," she replied, her tone steady and calm, showing neither fear nor frustration. She knew all too well where this could go if she let her emotions get the best of her. But that calm demeanor only seemed to irk Officer Miller. He looked her over as though trying to find something amiss. To him, Alara's calmness was a challenge, as if she was daring him to do his job. His voice grew louder, his tone sharper. "Don't you get smart with me," he said, crossing his arms and eyeing her with suspicion. "You can't just stand around here loitering like you own the place. Do you have any ID on you?" Alara, aware of the small crowd that was beginning to form around them, gently reached into her bag and pulled out her driver's license, handing it to him without a word. The last thing she wanted was to create a scene, yet she couldn't ignore the growing tension. The air around them felt charged, as if every word spoken carried a weight that the crowd could feel, like a drum beat building to an inevitable crescendo. Miller barely glanced at her ID before handing it back, as if her answer didn't matter, only his assumptions did. He scoffed, looking at her in disgust. "You know, people like you think you can just walk wherever you please. No respect for the rules, do you?" he said, his tone dripping with disdain. And then, in a moment that would be etched in the memories of everyone present, he spat on the ground in front of her, a raw act of disrespect that sent a wave of shock through the onlookers. Alara held herself still, her hands clenching around her bag as she held back the surge of anger rising within her. She had faced moments like this before, but rarely so blatantly. The years of having to be composed, having to be stronger than the biases thrown at her, had taught her how to keep her head high even when someone tried to pull her down. Around them, the crowd murmured, some gasping in disbelief at the officer's actions. A few people began pulling out their phones, recording the incident, sensing the injustice, and perhaps hoping that this moment would bring accountability. As the silence thickened, Alara finally spoke, her voice steady, every word carefully measured. "Officer Miller, I think you should know something about who I am," she said, reaching back into her bag. Her calmness now took on a new edge, one that made Miller hesitate, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But he quickly brushed it off, a mocking grin forming on his lips. "Oh yeah? And who do you think you are?" he taunted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He crossed his arms, standing tall as if daring her to give him an answer. Alara pulled out a badge, gleaming under the morning light, and held it up for him to see. The crowd grew quiet, sensing a shift in the air. "I am the new chief of police for this district," she said, her voice calm, yet filled with undeniable authority. The mocking grin slipped from Miller's face, replaced by an expression of disbelief, and a few gasps rippled through the crowd. Miller's eyes darted to the badge and then back to her face, struggling to process what was happening. He opened his mouth, ready to protest, to argue, to insist this was some sort of joke, but Alara didn't give him the chance. She let her badge do the talking as the reality of the situation sank in. She could see the shock settling into his expression, the dawning horror as he realized just how deep of a hole he had dug for himself. The silence following Alara's calm assertion hung heavy in the air. Alara could feel the eyes of the onlookers watching her, some with sympathy, others with a flicker of fear, as if they knew where this might lead. But she kept her posture calm, her face neutral. She had learned long ago that meeting anger with anger only gave fuel to those who would disrespect her. Today, she would hold her composure despite Miller's blatant hostility. Miller, however, was undeterred by her calm. In his eyes, Alara's poise seemed to mock him, a challenge to his authority he was unwilling to tolerate. His jaw clenched, and his eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, his imposing frame leaning forward in a way meant to intimidate. "Listen," he sneered, his voice low but dripping with contempt. "You may think you're something special, but I've seen people like you come and go, thinking they're above the rules." He spat the words as if they left a bitter taste in his mouth. His tone was laced with the same disdain as before, but there was something sharper now, an edge of irritation mixed with an unwillingness to back down. Alara remained silent, her gaze steady, refusing to be baited. Her quiet resolve seemed to infuriate Miller even more. His face writhed as his irritation boiled over. "Don't just stand there," he barked, raising his voice as if somehow his volume would make his words more powerful. "Who do you think you are, standing around here like you own the place?" He pointed an accusing finger toward her, his tone dripping with disdain. "This is not your neighborhood. You don't get to stroll around here like it's yours." The crowd that had gathered was growing. Some people murmured in disapproval. Others shook their heads, visibly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding in front of them. A few began filming on their phones, hoping their recordings might later be used to shed light on the officer's behavior. But Alara was no stranger to this kind of treatment, no stranger to the assumptions and biases that came with being a black woman in a position of authority, though of course, Miller didn't yet know her rank. Miller crossed his arms, exuding a smug arrogance as he tried to pull Alara's focus back to him. As if determined to show his dominance, he leaned closer, his voice a harsh whisper meant only for her ears. "I've dealt with enough like you, thinking you can outsmart the badge. Let me remind you who's really in charge here." As Alara took a deep breath, she sensed the shift in the crowd's mood. People were growing more uncomfortable, their faces reflecting shock, anger, and a sense of helplessness. But Miller wasn't done yet. He decided to push even further, raising his voice again to make sure everyone around could hear. "Maybe you don't understand how things work around here," he continued, looking her up and down with a condescending gaze. "But let me make it real simple for you. You don't belong here. So unless you want to cause more trouble, I suggest you take yourself out of here and go back to where you came from." His words were biting, each one meant to cut deep, and he took pleasure in them, savoring the moment he thought he had put her in her place. Alara's calm mask remained intact, but inside, a fire was building. She had dealt with people like him before, who thought that authority was a weapon to wield, not a responsibility to uphold. She knew that Miller's anger stemmed not from anything she had done, but from his assumptions about who she was and what she represented. And while his words cut deep, she was determined not to let him see any sign of that. Miller, growing frustrated by her silent composure, sneered and took his final step of disrespect. "You think you're too good for a simple warning, huh?" he said, his voice dropping to a low, angry hiss. And then, as if to punctuate his words with a final insult, he spat on the ground at her feet, a deliberate, degrading gesture that sent shock waves through the onlookers. There was an audible gasp from the crowd. A woman near the front covered her mouth in shock, her eyes wide with disbelief. Others shook their heads, some muttering under their breath about the blatant disrespect. The air grew tense, and the silence that followed felt suffocating, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see how Alara would react. Alara's pulse quickened as she watched the man before her, every ounce of her willpower holding her steady. She could feel the weight of his insult, the raw, blatant hatred in that single gesture. But Alara knew that any reaction she gave would be precisely what Miller wanted. So instead, she looked down at the spot where he had spat, a calm, measured look crossing her face, as if she were considering something far deeper than what anyone else could see. When she looked back up, there was a steeliness in her gaze that hadn't been there before, a calm authority that filled the space between them. Miller, suddenly uncertain, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, momentarily thrown off balance by the intensity in her eyes. Finally, in a voice that was barely above a whisper yet powerful enough to cut through the silence, Alara spoke. "Officer Miller," she said, holding his gaze, her tone measured, authoritative, and unwavering. I think you should know a little more about who I am. Miller's confidence wavered, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. Oh really? He said, forcing a mocking laugh. And who are you supposed to be? The onlookers leaned forward, their phones poised, the anticipation palpable. Alara reached calmly into her bag, her every movement controlled and deliberate, as if she were taking her time on purpose. When she withdrew her badge and held it up for him to see, there was a collective gasp. The crowd went silent, their attention entirely on her. I'm the new chief of police for this district, she said, each word ringing out clear and strong. Her eyes never left Miller's face, watching as his expression changed from one of smug amusement to utter shock and disbelief. For the first time since he'd approached her, Miller looked genuinely thrown off. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The badge gleaming in her hand told him everything he needed to know. It was real. She was real. And he had just insulted the new chief of police in front of a crowd of witnesses. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd as realization set in. Phones were held up, cameras flashing, and every eye was focused on the scene that had just unfolded, documenting this unforgettable moment of karma, justice, and the courage of one woman who had dared to stand firm against hatred. The silence that settled over the crowd was thick and electrifying. Every eye was locked onto Alara as she held up her badge, the symbol of authority glinting in the sunlight. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm, steady words cut through the air with the force of a revelation. I am the new chief of police for this district, she repeated, her voice unwavering, her gaze fixed firmly on Officer Miller. For a moment, it was as if time itself froze. Miller stood rooted to the spot, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. He blinked, his eyes narrowing as though he couldn't comprehend the scene in front of him. His mind seemed to be racing, trying to process the fact that this woman, the very woman he had just insulted, humiliated, and disrespected in front of a crowd, was not only a fellow officer, but his superior. A beat of silence passed, then another. Miller's sneer melted, replaced by an expression of raw shock. He took a half-step back, his mouth slightly open, as if words might somehow tumble out to rescue him from the catastrophic mistake he just made. But no words came. The crowd, sensing the shift, held their collective breath. Bystanders' phones, still held high, caught every twitch of his face, every ounce of disbelief written on his features. Those who had watched in disgust now looked on with satisfaction, their murmurs growing louder like a wave building up strength, cresting with the knowledge that justice was unfolding before them. Miller's eyes darted from Alara's badge to her face, desperately searching for any sign that this might be a cruel joke or a trick. His fingers twitched by his side, his face turning an ashen shade as realization seeped into his expression. He opened his mouth to speak, to say anything that might explain away his behavior, to mitigate the inevitable consequences, but the words, whatever they were, stuck in his throat. Alara's eyes never wavered, her expression unflinching as she took a slow step forward. Her presence, now fortified by her position, radiated with authority and strength. The composure she'd held throughout the encounter, which Miller had mistaken for passivity, now took on a new meaning, a confidence that transcended the insult he'd spat at her just moments before. Finally, Miller managed a strangled, disbelieving laugh, his voice trembling as he tried to muster any shred of his former arrogance. You're joking, right? He said, his voice a weak shadow of the confidence he had shown earlier. His eyes scanned her badge again, almost pleading with it to reveal itself as fake, as if his denial alone could somehow alter reality. But Alara's face remained impassive, her gaze fixed on him with a sense of resolute calm that now seemed to unnerve him. Her eyes held a weight that spoke of experience, resilience, and authority. She had dealt with people like him before, men who thought the badge they wore gave them the right to disrespect, to disregard, to demean. And she had risen through those encounters, becoming stronger each time, proving to herself and others that she could stand tall in the face of such prejudice. You think I'm joking? She asked softly, but her tone was laced with a steel edge that silenced him instantly. She took another step forward, closing the distance between them, letting the reality of her words settle in. Officer Miller, she continued, her voice calm but firm, resonating with the authority of her position. This badge, she held it up, letting it catch the light, is as real as the consequences of your actions today. You chose to disrespect a woman you knew nothing about based on assumptions and prejudices that have no place in this uniform. Miller's face flushed with a mix of humiliation and panic. He looked around at the crowd, searching for support, for any sign that this nightmare unfolding around him might somehow resolve in his favor. But the faces staring back at him were filled with contempt, with satisfaction that the tables had finally turned. The crowd had seen everything: his aggression, his condescension, and now his humiliation. Desperation flickered across Miller's face as he tried to salvage the last fragments of his shattered pride. He stammered, his voice dropping to a pleading tone, his arrogance replaced by a fear he could no longer hide. "Chief, I didn't know. I thought." His words faltered as he scrambled to explain himself, each stammered phrase a testament to his disbelief and panic. But Alara's expression remained unchanged, as if his excuses were as hollow as his earlier taunts. "You thought what?" she asked, her voice sharp but controlled, challenging him to finish the sentence he could barely begin. "You thought you could treat me however you liked because you assumed I had no power? No authority?" She shook her head slowly, her eyes hardening. "Your badge does not give you the right to treat people with disrespect. In fact, it demands the opposite." Miller opened his mouth to respond, but Alara held up her hand, silencing him with a single gesture. She wasn't interested in excuses and the hollow words of a man who had only shown remorse when he realized his actions had consequences. "This is what I believe in, officer," she said, her voice resolute, carrying across the gathering crowd. "Every officer who wears this badge must treat people with dignity, respect, and honor. This badge represents service, not superiority. And as chief of police, I will ensure that every officer in my command understands that." The crowd's quiet murmur turned into approving nods, expressions of satisfaction crossing their faces as they took in the sight of Alara standing tall. Here she was, a woman of power, reminding a man who had tried to diminish her that respect is not something given based on appearances or assumptions, but something earned through integrity. Miller, visibly deflated now, stood awkwardly, his eyes downcast, his once proud posture crumbling in the face of the truth. He had no defense, no ground left to stand on. Alara's words had exposed not only his actions in that moment, but the mindset that had driven them. The crowd watched, their phones capturing every second as Miller's confidence evaporated, replaced by an expression of raw, unmistakable shame. As Alara lowered her badge, she took one final, steadying breath, letting the weight of her words sink in. She had made her point, not through anger or retaliation, but through the undeniable truth of her authority, a truth that Miller could no longer deny. And in that moment, the roles had completely reversed. The power he had tried to wield over her now belonged solely to her, and there was nothing he could do to reclaim it. The crowd began to applaud, a ripple of support and admiration sweeping through them as they realized they had witnessed a moment of justice, a moment that would stay with them long after they walked away. Miller stood amid the applause, shrinking under its weight, as Alara, the true authority, the true leader, stood tall and unflinching, embodying the strength and resilience that had brought her to this moment. The crowd's attention had shifted from shock to anticipation. Everyone watching, recording, whispering to each other about the unfolding scene. Officer Miller's face, once smug and sure, was now a mask of panic and confusion. He looked around, as if hoping to find an escape from the consequences barreling toward him. Just then, the distant sound of sirens cut through the hum of the city streets, growing louder as they approached. The crowd parted slightly, their faces filled with curiosity and expectation. A pair of patrol cars pulled up to the curb, and out stepped 3 officers, all wearing expressions of concern as they scanned the scene. Miller's relief was visible as he spotted his fellow officers, his face brightening slightly, hoping they would back him up, perhaps even help defuse the situation. But as the new arrivals took in the scene, Miller standing rigidly beside Alara, the crowd murmuring, phones held high, and Alara's badge gleaming in her hand, they quickly sensed the gravity of the moment. The first officer to approach was Sergeant Marcus Evans, a seasoned officer in his 50s with a sharp eye and a commanding presence. He strode forward, glancing between Miller and Alara, piecing together the scene as he approached. Behind him, 2 younger officers followed, their expressions unreadable as they took in the tension in the air. "Officer Miller," Sergeant Evans began, his voice low but firm. "What's going on here?" His gaze swept across the scene, lingering briefly on the cameras pointed in their direction. There was a tension in his stance, a recognition that this was not just a simple street encounter. It was something far more significant. Miller, visibly nervous, forced a smile, gesturing toward Alara dismissively. "It's nothing, Sergeant," he said quickly, his voice carrying a shaky, defensive tone. "Just handling a loitering situation." But as he spoke, Sergeant Evans' gaze settled on Alara's badge. His eyes widened slightly, and he immediately snapped to attention, recognizing the badge that marked her as his superior. His expression shifted from concern to shock and then to respect as he looked at Alara with an understanding of who she was and what she represented. The two younger officers exchanged glances, their faces reflecting the same realization that had just dawned on Evans. They both straightened up, adjusting their postures, acknowledging the woman standing in front of them not as a random civilian, but as Chief Alara Morgan, the newly appointed leader. "Chief Morgan," Evans said, his voice respectful, tinged with a slight tremor as he grasped the gravity of the situation. I wasn't aware you were on duty here." His words were measured, as if he was choosing them carefully to show his respect and avoid the same mistake Miller had just made. Alara inclined her head, acknowledging Evans' professionalism. "Sergeant Evans," she replied evenly, her voice calm, yet carrying a weight that made her authority unmistakable. "I wasn't here on duty. I was here as a citizen, simply waiting for my coffee, when Officer Miller decided to make assumptions and treat me with blatant disrespect." Evans' face darkened, a mixture of anger and disbelief flashing across his features as he realized what had transpired. He turned to Miller, his expression hardening, his respect for Alara highlighting Miller's mistake in sharper relief. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, grew quieter, hanging on to every word. Miller's face flushed a deep shade of red as Evans' eyes bore into him. Disappointment etched into every line of the sergeant's face. The two younger officers looked at Miller, their expressions now unreadable but clearly far from supportive. Miller's attempts to control had backfired, and his arrogance had left him standing alone in the wake of his actions. Seeing his support crumble, Miller stammered, his tone becoming defensive. "Sergeant, I didn't know. I thought." He looked at Alara, his face a mix of desperation and regret. But Alara's face remained impassive, unyielding. "Thought what, Officer Miller?" Evans interjected sharply, cutting him off. "Thought you could disrespect a citizen? Thought you could treat someone like this based on what exactly?" Evans' voice was firm, holding Miller accountable with every question. Miller's mouth opened and closed, struggling to respond, his earlier arrogance completely gone. The confidence that had fueled his actions had dissolved, replaced by the cold reality that he was now facing the consequences he had never expected. Alara's voice broke the silence, each word measured, each syllable sharp as a blade. "Sergeant Evans," she said, her tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. "I expect every officer under my command to act with respect, integrity, and professionalism, values that Officer Miller has clearly chosen to ignore today." Evans nodded, his respect for Alara clear in the way he held himself. "Understood, Chief Morgan," he said. He turned to Miller, his face set in a look of resolute disappointment. "Officer Miller, you are relieved of your duties effective immediately, pending a full investigation into this incident." Miller's face went pale, his jaw dropping as the weight of the words struck him. "Sergeant, please, this isn't necessary. I didn't know." His voice wavered, a stark contrast to the smug confidence he had worn earlier. But Evans didn't waver. "Officer Miller," he said sternly, "the badge you wear comes with responsibility, not privilege. And today, you chose to disrespect both the badge and the people you swore to protect. There is no place for that in this department." The crowd murmured approvingly, nodding and whispering among themselves, their satisfaction palpable as they witnessed Miller's fall from grace. Some even clapped, grateful to see accountability unfolding in front of them, a sign that justice was not just a concept, but something real, something alive in the hands of leaders like Alara Morgan. Miller looked around, searching the faces of the other officers, hoping for some last shred of support, but there was none. The younger officers watched him with expressions of quiet judgment, their loyalty clearly aligned with Alara and the values she represented. Alara, watching him closely, spoke once more, her voice carrying a finality that left no room for argument. "Officer Miller," she said, her tone steady. What you did here today is a disgrace to this uniform. You showed everyone exactly who you are, and now you will face the consequences of that choice. As the reality settled over Miller, he lowered his head, finally realizing that there was no redemption in this moment, no escape from the repercussions he had brought upon himself. The authority he had wielded with arrogance had been stripped away, and in its place was the cold reality of accountability. Alara turned to Evans, nodding with a sense of satisfaction. "Sergeant, thank you for your swift response," she said, her tone warm but resolute, acknowledging his professionalism. She looked at the younger officers, who nodded respectfully, silently pledging their loyalties to her leadership and the integrity she stood for. With Miller officially removed, the crowd began to disperse, their expressions a mixture of admiration for Alara and satisfaction at the justice they had witnessed. Alara stood tall, her presence radiating strength and authority as the officers around her took in the lesson that had just unfolded, a lesson that dignity and respect were not optional but mandatory. As Alara walked away, the weight of her words lingered in the air, a powerful reminder that justice, even in the smallest moments, had the ability to transform, to change, to inspire. And those who had watched her that day would carry the memory of her strength and resilience, knowing they had witnessed the dawn of a new era of integrity and respect. With Officer Miller dismissed from the scene, he stood alone, a figure stripped of his former arrogance, reduced to a shadow of the man who had once dominated this street with his imposing stance. The crowd's murmur faded as Alara took a breath, letting the magnitude of the moment sink in. Her words had silenced not only Miller but the biases and assumptions that he had carried with him, a statement that resonated far beyond him alone. Sergeant Evans approached Alara, his eyes filled with respect. "Chief Morgan," he said quietly, "would you like me to handle the report on this incident personally?" Alara nodded. "Thank you, Sergeant. This incident will require a full review, not only for Miller's actions today, but for his entire record. If his behavior here is any indication, there may be more beneath the surface." Her words hung in the air, a subtle but powerful reminder that true accountability went beyond a single act. It meant addressing the roots of a problem, dismantling the systems and behaviors that allow people like Miller to act unchecked. The crowd around them sensed the weight of her words, understanding that this was more than just a response to one disrespectful officer. It was a shift in the way things would be done moving forward. As Miller looked at her, a mix of resentment and fear in his eyes, Alara turned to face him directly. The crowd's attention refocused, silence descending as everyone watched her deliver the final judgment. "Officer Miller," Alara began, her voice steady, her gaze piercing. "You took an oath when you put on that uniform, an oath to serve and protect all members of this community. Today, you showed that you have no respect for that oath, for your badge, or for the people you were sworn to protect. You betrayed that responsibility. You used your power not for justice, but to belittle and demean others." Miller's face writhed, his fists clenching by his sides as he struggled with the reality of her words. He looked like he wanted to speak, to defend himself, but he couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. Alara continued, her voice growing stronger, each word deliberate and unwavering. "Let this be a message to every officer who believes they are above the values of integrity, respect, and dignity. Under my leadership, there will be no tolerance for discrimination, for abuse of power, or for those who think they can wear this badge as a shield for their own prejudices." The crowd murmured approvingly, nodding in agreement, a few people even applauding softly. Her words resonated, a powerful message that reached beyond Miller to every officer who might be watching, every member of the community who had been waiting for a leader who would stand for justice without compromise. Miller's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of his mistake, the irreparable damage he had done to his reputation, his career, and his standing in the department. The crowd's eyes bore into him, some with disgust, others with pity. The impact of what he had done was written on every face around him, a collective judgment that would not be easily forgotten. "Effective immediately," Alara declared, her voice carrying across the crowd. "You are suspended without pay, pending an internal investigation. And know this, your actions today will not be swept under the rug. They will be documented, reviewed, and made part of your record. If there are other incidents like this in your past, you will be held accountable for them as well. Miller's face paled, his expression crumbling as he realized this was not just a temporary consequence. His career, his standing, everything he had taken for granted was slipping through his fingers, all because of a choice he had made out of arrogance and prejudice. Sergeant Evans stepped forward, gesturing for Miller to follow him. Miller hesitated, looking as though he might protest, but one look from Alara reminded him that his authority here was gone. Slowly, reluctantly, he walked away, his head hanging low, the crowd parting to let him pass. He could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their silent judgment, and he knew that this was a stain on his reputation that would never fade. As Evans led Miller to the waiting patrol car, Alara turned to address the remaining officers who had witnessed the entire scene. They stood straighter, a new respect evident in their posture, recognizing the weight of the values she had laid out before them. "This department will hold itself to a higher standard," Alara said, her voice filled with determination. "I expect each of you to remember that the badge you wear is a symbol of trust, one that the people of this community have placed in you. Do not take it lightly. Abuse of power, disrespect, and prejudice have no place in this department, and under my leadership, there will be no tolerance for those who fail to uphold that standard." The officers nodded solemnly, the gravity of her words sinking in. They could see that Alara was a leader who would not back down, who would demand the best of her team, and who would hold them accountable not just in words but in action. This wasn't just a speech, it was a promise, one that would shape the future of their department. Finally, she turned to the crowd, her gaze softening as she looked at the faces that had watched, recorded, and silently hoped for justice. She knew that many of them had probably experienced discrimination themselves or had watched others face it, helpless to intervene. But today, she had shown them that there was hope, that change was possible, that someone in power was willing to stand up for what was right. "Thank you all for being here today," she said, addressing them directly. "This community deserves a police force that respects and protects everyone. I promise you that as chief, I will do everything in my power to make that a reality. Your voices, your concerns, and your dignity will be respected." Today was the first step toward building a department that serves with integrity, with respect, and with the commitment to justice that every citizen deserves. The crowd erupted in applause, the energy electric as people clapped, cheered, and shouted words of support. A woman near the front, her eyes brimming with tears, held her hand to her chest, visibly moved by Alara's words. Others clapped louder, their applause echoing down the street, a ripple of gratitude and hope that spread through the gathered crowd. Alara stood there, taking in the sight, a sense of fulfillment washing over her. She had made a difference today, not just by holding Miller accountable, but by showing the community and her department that change was possible, that justice could prevail even in small, unexpected moments. As she turned to leave, a little girl in the crowd tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Mommy, I want to be like her when I grow up." The mother smiled, looking down at her daughter with pride before lifting her gaze to Alara, silently thanking her with a nod. Alara gave the girl a warm smile, feeling a sense of responsibility and inspiration. Walking away, Alara knew the work ahead would be challenging, that there would be other Millers to face, other battles to fight. But she also knew that she had set a new tone, a new standard, and a new path for her department and her community. And as she disappeared from view, the crowd slowly dispersed, carrying with them the memory of a leader who had reminded them of what justice, integrity, and accountability truly meant. The next day, the entire city was buzzing. News of the previous day's incident had spread quickly, the video footage going viral across social media and local news channels. Headlines carried the story, calling it a stand for justice and the chief who held her own. People across the city had watched as the newly appointed chief of police took a stand against one of her own officers, demanding the respect and accountability that the community had long been yearning for. With so much public attention, Alara knew this was the right moment to share her vision openly. She called for a press conference, inviting not only the media but members of the community, activists, and city officials. It was time to address the public directly, to outline the principles and values that would define her leadership. The stage was set in front of the police department headquarters, with rows of seats filled by community members, officers, and reporters. Camera crews adjusted their angles as Alara stepped up to the podium, her uniform crisp, her expression serious yet open, embodying the integrity she had always championed. She scanned the audience, her gaze falling on familiar faces. Her officers, some who had watched yesterday's events unfold, and others who had heard about it later. She saw the woman from the crowd who had cheered for her, now sitting in the front row, and next to her, the little girl who had looked up to Alara with awe. Alara cleared her throat, and the crowd quieted, every eye fixed on her. She began with a measured tone, her voice carrying a strength that left no room for doubt. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "Yesterday, we all witnessed a situation that none of us should ever have to see, a situation where an officer used his authority as a weapon instead of a shield. It was a reminder of why we are here and why we wear this badge. This badge does not make us better than those we serve. It is not a license to look down on others. It is a responsibility, a pledge, and a commitment to honor, to respect, and to protect every person in our community." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Many nodded, visibly moved as Alara spoke the words they had waited so long to hear. "As chief of police," she continued, her voice steady, "I will not tolerate discrimination or abuse of power in any form. Yesterday's incident was a stark example of what happens when we allow prejudice and unchecked authority to go unchallenged. But let me be clear, this is not just about one officer, one incident. This is about building a culture, a standard of respect and accountability that is woven into the very fabric of this department." The reporter's cameras flashed, capturing the intensity in her eyes, the resolve that had come to define her as a leader in such a short time. Alara took a breath, letting the weight of her words sink in before she continued. "This department will undergo comprehensive reform," she announced, her voice carrying across the rows of seats, the gathered crowd, and the open street beyond. "We will implement mandatory bias training, regular performance reviews, and increased accountability measures for every officer. I am establishing a community oversight board to review complaints and to ensure that we are meeting the standards of respect and justice that our citizens deserve." There was a wave of applause from the audience, and Alara noticed the approving nods of local community leaders and activists who had long been advocating for change. Their support meant the world to her. It was a reminder that she wasn't doing this alone, that her vision was shared by many who believed in a brighter, fairer future. But Alara wasn't done yet. She leaned forward slightly, her tone becoming more personal, more direct. "I know that trust has been broken between the police and this community. I know that rebuilding that trust will not happen overnight. It will require consistency, transparency, and a commitment to justice that goes beyond words. I am committed to earning that trust back, not through grand gestures, but through everyday actions, through every call, every interaction, every decision." She paused, her gaze falling on the young girl in the front row, the one who had whispered to her mother, "I want to be like her when I grow up." Alara smiled at her, and the girl smiled back, her eyes wide with admiration. Turning back to the crowd, Alara's voice softened, filled with a resolve that reached beyond the moment. "When we wear this uniform, we represent more than ourselves. We represent the values we believe in. And I believe in a police force that serves with compassion, that stands up for the vulnerable, that protects without prejudice. That is the department I am committed to building, one that reflects the dignity, the respect, and the humanity of every person in our community." The crowd burst into applause, people rising from their seats, their clapping filling the street, echoing off the buildings. Alara felt a surge of emotion, pride, determination, and hope as she looked out over the sea of faces, each one holding a piece of the vision she was fighting to bring to life. As the applause died down, Alara took a final moment to address her officers, her team, who had gathered to support her, to hear her call for change. "To every officer here today," she said, her voice filled with warmth and strength, "this vision isn't just mine, it's yours. I believe in your commitment to justice and your dedication to this community. Together, we can be the force that restores trust, that rebuilds respect, that sets a new standard for what it means to serve and protect." The officers, many of whom had watched the events of the previous day, now stood straighter, their expressions solemn but inspired. They nodded, pledging their silent agreement, their commitment to the change Alara was bringing. They knew this would not be an easy path, but they also knew that Alara's leadership would guide them through it. As Alara stepped back from the podium, The crowd erupted once more in applause. Community leaders, activists, officers, and citizens all rose together in a standing ovation, united by a sense of hope, a belief that they were on the brink of something transformative. In the days that followed, Alera's reforms began to take shape. Officers attended the first of many training sessions, learning about the biases and responsibilities that came with their roles. The Community Oversight Board was established, giving residents a voice, a way to hold the department accountable. And gradually, a change began to ripple through the department, a new sense of purpose, of unity, of respect. And as for Alera, she continued to lead by example, embodying the values she had set forth, proving to her team and her community that change was possible, that integrity and justice could be more than ideals. They could be the foundation of something real. In time, people would look back on that day, the day a chief had stood her ground and reminded everyone, officers and citizens alike, of what it meant to serve with honor. And in every interaction, every decision, Alera's vision lived on, transforming her department, her community, and the lives of everyone who looked to her as a beacon of hope, a symbol of justice. As the applause subsided, Alera took one last look at the crowd, a sea of faces filled with admiration, respect, and most importantly, hope. She had seen that hope before, in glimpses and moments of triumph and change, but today it felt stronger, more tangible. It was a reminder that the power of leadership wasn't only in setting standards, but in inspiring others to believe in those standards, to see themselves as part of something greater. Slowly, she stepped down from the podium, and as she made her way through the crowd, people reached out, eager to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her that her actions had restored something within them. For some, it was faith in law enforcement. For others, it was the belief that someone in power could still act with compassion and integrity. And for all, it was a moment to see justice not just as a word or an ideal, but as something real, something attainable. A young black man stepped forward, a sense of pride in his eyes. "Chief Morgan, my son watched that video with me last night," he said, his voice catching with emotion. "He told me, 'Dad, I want to be a cop now like her.'" The man's words were filled with gratitude, and as he looked at Alera, his eyes shone with tears. "Thank you. You've given him, and all of us, something to believe in." Alera took his hand, her own heart swelling with the impact of his words. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft yet steady. "It's for your son and for every person in this community that I do this work. It's for the belief that one day he'll wear this badge with pride and without fear, knowing he serves a community that respects him as much as he respects it." As she moved on, Alera felt a warmth growing within her, a sense of purpose that extended beyond herself. The applause, the gratitude, and the shared feeling of change in the air were not just acknowledgments of her actions. They were reflections of a collective desire for a better future. Later that evening, as Alera returned to her office, she sat down at her desk, the sounds of the city outside her window a comforting reminder of the world she was working to protect and change. She leaned back, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, the challenges she'd faced, the doubts she'd overcome, and the countless times she'd had to prove herself had all been steps toward this moment. In a journal she kept in her drawer, she wrote a single line: "Change begins with one act of courage, but continues with countless acts of integrity." She knew that today had been one of those acts of courage, but tomorrow, and every day after that, would require integrity, consistency, and the unwavering belief that justice was not just a destination but a path, one she would walk every single day. The days that followed were marked by transformation. News of Alera's actions spread, and her commitment to reform set a new precedent that other cities began to notice, adopting similar measures to promote transparency and accountability. Alera's story inspired those beyond her city, creating a ripple effect as people everywhere felt empowered to demand justice, to hold their leaders accountable, and to believe that respect and equity could indeed be woven into the foundation of public service. For the officers who served under her, Alera became not only a leader but a symbol of what was possible. They saw in her a reminder that the badge they wore was a privilege, not a right, and that the power they wielded should be used for the good of the community, never to harm or demean. They embraced the new standard she had set, recognizing that their duty was to protect every person, to be stewards of peace, and to serve with a humility that was reflected in their every action. And for the community, Alera's actions became a beacon of trust. People who had once looked upon the department with skepticism, who had felt dismissed or overlooked, now saw the change firsthand. They saw a chief who was willing to listen, to stand beside them, and to remind every officer of their shared humanity. With each passing day, the walls that had separated the community from its protectors began to crumble, replaced by bridges of respect and understanding. One day, months later, Alera found herself in a local park where a group of young children played under the watchful eyes of their parents. A little girl ran up to her, eyes wide with recognition and excitement. "Are you the lady from the news?" she asked, her face lighting up as Alera nodded, amused by the child's enthusiasm. You're the chief, right?" Alera knelt down, meeting the girl at eye level. "That's right. And do you know what the chief does?" The little girl nodded confidently. "You make sure everyone is safe and that people are nice to each other." Alera smiled, her heart warmed by the simplicity and truth of the child's words. "That's exactly right. And you know what? One day, you could be chief too." The girl's eyes sparkled with excitement as she ran back to her mother, already proclaiming her future plans. Alera watched her go, knowing that this moment, as simple as it was, embodied everything she had worked for. She had planted a seed of belief not only in that little girl, but in a generation that would grow up with the example she had set. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city, Alera walked through the park, taking in the sights and sounds of the community she loved. She felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that her work was making a difference, that her vision of respect and justice was taking root, growing stronger with every passing day. And as she looked out over the city, she understood that the path of change was a long one, but it was worth every step. She had become more than a leader. She was a part of the community, a part of the hope that shone in the eyes of those who believed in her. For Alera, the journey was just beginning, but she knew with unshakable certainty that her legacy would live on, not in words, but in the lives of those she had inspired and the people she had empowered, and in the promise of a future where justice was not just a dream, but a reality for all.